Good evening, I'm Mike Knetter, and welcome to the UW Now Livestream series, where we bring you experts from the UW community on timely and important topics. Tonight, we'll take up the return to office, or what we're calling post-pandemic professionalism. After a year in which many firms shifted to remote work, employers and employees alike are planning for the post-pandemic new normal. And tonight, we're going to dive into the data on firm and worker preferences and productivity considerations regarding remote or hybrid work once the pandemic is over. And the real questions are we going to just go back to the old ways? After all, we thought they were optimal before, or did the pandemic drive innovation that is here to stay? Let's find out. Joining us tonight are three experts to discuss the transition and take your questions. Sarah Condella is Executive Vice President of Human Resources at Exact Sciences. Jirs Meuris is an Assistant Professor in the Management and Human Resources Department at the Wisconsin School of Business. And Rector is the Vice President of Human Resources Consulting for the QTI Group. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I know we're midstream on these issues, and I know we're all looking forward to hearing your thoughts from your various perspectives. So kicking us off tonight will be Rector, who earned her BBA in Management and Human Resources from the Wisconsin School of Business. Summer's the VP of HR Consulting for the QTI Group, a staffing, recruitment, and full-service HR firm located right here in Madison. A great partner of the university, I might add. Rector also leads QTI's Belonging, Inclusion, and Diversity Committee, and prior to joining QTI, she worked in HR administration and consulting at Mercer, Day 9 Accenture, and Healthcare Service Corporation. She's also the Vice President of the Board of Directors of the Literacy Network and a faculty member in the HR Management School of the UW-Madison's Graduate School of Banking. She frequently presents locally and nationally on a variety of total rewards and HR topics, and conveniently for us, was just involved in a major study of employer and employee preferences on the return to work model. So Summer, thank you for being with us tonight, and we look forward to hearing your tour of the data and what you've learned so far.
Thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here. If you don't mind pulling up the slides, I'd be happy to take you through some of those survey results that we found. Starting on the first slide here, COVID-19 has, of course, had a huge impact on remote work. In only a few weeks, we went from 3.6% of the U.S. workforce to 52% working remotely half-time or more. Now, looking forward post-pandemic, 29% of the workforce is anticipated to work remotely half-time or more. Of course, we're all learning as we go, but one thing appears certain. Remote work in some capacity is here to stay. Next slide. Now, why is that? Well, for the most part, research from Live Career and Microsoft shows that employees want to work remotely. 81% of working professionals enjoy working remotely. 73% want flexible remote options to stay. 65% say remote work has positively affected their work-life balance. 29% go so far as to say that they would quit their jobs if they couldn't continue working remotely. Further, it appears that most employers are open to remote work, and this was confirmed locally by a remote work pulse survey of over 250 employers that QTI recently performed. So our survey found that 94% of organizations say that remote employees have met or exceeded performance expectations. 90% plan to allow remote work in some capacity post-pandemic, and 64% indicated that an employee may work remotely if the job does not require physical presence. Additional research from Microsoft finds that 66% of organizations are considering redesigning physical workspaces to better accommodate hybrid work environments, or a mix of in-person and remote work arrangements. Next slide. Now, per QTI's survey, remote work policy appears to be related with organization size in terms of employee count. The smaller the organization, the more likely that most or all employees will be required to either work remotely and or will have the choice to work remotely or at a worksite location. The larger the organization, the more likely that remote work will be determined selectively by job and employee. Overall, however, only 10% of organizations say that no remote work will be permitted. Next slide. Now, employer openness to remote work may make sense given all the associated benefits. For example, remote work is associated with a 13% increase in employee performance. It can increase job applicants by 30%, allowing for a more diverse employee pool. It is associated with a 50% drop in employee quit rates and 40% fewer quality defects. The savings can be significant too. So a typical employer can save about $11,000 per year for every employee who works remotely half-time or more through such savings in real estate expenses, office supplies, etc. Employees can also save, so they can save about $4,000 per year by working remotely at least part-time through lower travel, clothing, meal expenses. Teleworkers have also been found to be 35 to 40% more productive than their office counterparts. Lastly, remote work is associated with 41% lower absenteeism. Next slide. Yet for all these benefits, we know that there are many challenges of remote work too. First, fairness. Not every job can be performed remotely, and that can lead to perceptions of inequity. We also know that it can be hard to directly supervise how employees are performing while they work remotely. Remote work employees may be more susceptible to loneliness. Additionally, remote work may have been viewed as a perk pre-COVID, but if an employee is forced to work remotely, it may make remote work less desirable. Privacy can be a concern if the employee is sharing the home and has limited space available for a dedicated office. Technology can be a challenge, such as for those with unreliable internet connections. Further, remote work can contribute to employees feeling burned out. Next slide. Another concern is that digital overload is real and climbing, according to data from Microsoft's 2021 Work Trend Index report. So compared to pre-COVID levels, the amount of time spent in meetings has increased 148%. There are 40 billion more emails being delivered. There has been a 45% increase in Teams chats, and there is 66% more time spent editing documents. So while productivity may be higher through remote work, there's a question of how long it can be sustained in this way. Next slide. Another major challenge is that remote work teams are more siloed in a digital work world, according to Microsoft. So while interactions of immediate teams have increased, the interactions of more distant networks have actually diminished. Next slide. So why is it important that we work to overcome these challenges of remote work? Well, if we don't, remote work can increase job stress. Job stress is a growing issue and is estimated by the American Institute of Stress to cost U.S. companies more than $300 billion a year in health costs, absenteeism, turnover, and poor performance. In fact, prolonged job stress can lead to burnout, which the World Health Organization defines as a syndrome resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. Symptoms of burnout include feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion and reduced professional productivity. So clearly, burnout is not good for employees nor employers. Leading employers are working to prevent burnout of remote workers through intentional strategies and by demonstrating care in words and actions. Next slide. And guess what? Everyone wins when employers do so. As the Limeade research on this slide shows, caring is related to well-being, engagement, and inclusion. It is related to intent to stay and likelihood to recommend the employer. It is also related to lower stress and burnout. Some of the many examples of care that we are seeing from employers include giving employees choice in work location, establishing flexible work schedules, for example, for 10-hour days instead of the traditional 5 8-hour days, and also having one day each week dedicated to no web cameras to mitigate Zoom fatigue. Another way to demonstrate care that we're seeing is some employers make commitments to no meeting days, one day a week, to allow employees to catch up on work. We're also seeing employers that are connecting employees with mental health first aid and much more. Now, as I wrap up here, I'll share one final thought with you. The pandemic has given us opportunity to pause and challenge some of the traditional norms of work. Previously, most may have thought that work needed to be performed at work. This past year, we have experimented largely on the other end of the spectrum with work being performed remotely. I think the long-term answer for most employers and employees lies somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. I predict a hybrid workforce will be the next normal of the world of work, and I also predict those employers who succeed in demonstrating care for their employees will be the most successful.
Great. Well, thank you, Summer. Very insightful way to kick off our program tonight with all that data you shared, and we'll be back to you with some great questions from our audience and others.
Thank you.
Our next guest tonight is Sarah Condella. She's a 2-time Badger graduate with a degree in psychology and an MBA in management and human resources from the Wisconsin School of Business. She's the Executive Vice President of Human Resources at Exact Sciences. Those of us in Madison know the Exact Sciences story very well. For those of you who aren't in Madison, it's now a $20 billion market cap company with over 5,000 employees. They're a molecular diagnostics company, and they do terrific work and really support many people. Previously, Sarah served as a human resources manager at GE Healthcare and as a manager and project director at the University of Wisconsin Survey Center. She's a member of the Society for Human Resource Management and currently serves on the boards of Madison Children's Museum and Gilda's Club. Sarah, thank you for joining us tonight. I know you're not going to give away any trade secrets, but we'd love to know how you're thinking about the future of work at Exact Sciences and what factors you'll take into account when you decide what the new model will be.
Thanks, Mike. I'm so happy to be here and to also be learning from these other great panelists this evening. I have to say, Summer, thanks for all that data. I was feverishly writing it down to share with my team in the coming days. Well, I'll cut right to the chase and let you know that I'm not going to tell you that Exact Sciences has figured all of this out. We are still learning, and we are still taking time to assess and monitor return to work and learn from other companies and other experiences before we really solidify what post-pandemic work life and work location really means. I'll take you through the slides today and share with you just a little bit about the insights we've been gathering throughout the pandemic and some of the flexibility that we're hearing our employees are really looking for, and just share with you how we're considering approaching making decisions here. As Mike said, we're a molecular diagnostics company and are really proud of our vision to help eradicate cancer and the suffering that it causes, and proud to be here in Madison since 2009. So let me give you a perspective on our workforce. As Mike mentioned, we have over 5,000 employees. We have a global footprint. Employees are located in 8 different countries today. And the next slide will show you how our workforce was distributed before the pandemic in terms of being remote or on-site, and currently as we're still continuing to navigate the pandemic. As you can see, we were predominantly an on-site workforce, meaning people were showing up pretty much 5 days a week to work in an office location or in one of our laboratories, manufacturing sites, being also in the field with physicians and out with working with health systems in the medical environment. As you can see, we went through a huge shift when we flipped to what the pandemic work life looked like, where more than half of our employees are currently working remote. We've continued to have a pretty significant on-site presence as we do have essential critical workers performing those laboratory tests that provide results to patients. And that is something that did not slow down throughout the pandemic. And we had some interesting and I guess, great lessons learned on how to manage worker health and safety, feeling of well-being, and being taken care of when we had to work during those times on site. But as you can see, we have had to navigate that shift and have gone from being really in person to get things done to now really living with the virtual presence. Next slide. We've been surveying our employees every month since the pandemic began, and I'm so thankful that we've been able to monitor the trends and check in and get a pulse for what's on our employees' minds as it relates to how well they feel communication is going. Are they able to perform their job in these different times and different situations? Do they feel well taken care of? And do they feel connected? Are they still feeling that same energy of our culture and that connection to their colleagues and our mission? Now, what we've heard back as themes are no surprise to you, and I was nodding my head as Summer was presenting the data from QTI that they collected from many employers. It's really the same story. Flexibility is now the name of the game, and there's a huge desire to maintain some of that flexibility that we've seen because of the pandemic. A recent survey showed that 41% of those employees who are currently working from home want to stay fully remote, and most of those are employees who were working fully on-site prior to the pandemic. 49% of employees currently working from home prefer some sort of presence, either that includes both on-site as well as remote and work from home work. We also are hearing from our leaders that they really want help making decisions. How do I decide who can work remotely? Can people work fully remotely? What happens if I want to have meetings on site and people need to fly in for those meetings now because they choose to go live somewhere else? That piece about fairness is something else that I know our leaders are concerned about as they think about not wanting to make a decision that's going to negatively impact the morale of the team or create perceptions of inequity. We are also learning as we are bringing some people back to the office that hybrid meetings, that means meetings where some people are joining virtually and some people are in a room, in a conference room together, those require really solid technology and more planning, because that sense of engagement that you get when everybody is on Zoom or everybody's in a room is really hard to duplicate when you've got half and half or some type of hybrid situation. We also heard, and again, Summer mentioned this, there is a risk of feeling left out or feeling like people are left on an island, especially if some of the team will be on site and collaborating and interacting on a daily basis, while some might be left or choose to be working remotely. Next slide. One of the things I can share with you is that we are considering, instead of the pre-pandemic where we pretty much had two classifications, you were either an on-site employee coming in most of the time to an office location, or you worked remotely, worked from home, worked from the field for sales. Now we've introduced probably two more categories. One being local remote, meaning you live within a certain distance of a site. You have the ability to be on site. This might be for jobs where there's backup potential needed, or some on-site presence for training, meetings and events that require the team to come together more frequently than a couple times a year. There's also the flex hybrid, which I'm sure is something everyone has been hearing about or even practicing themselves. And this would allow for employees to have both on-site presence or residence, as well as flexible remote work options. Next slide. As I mentioned, we're really going through these considerations now. We've not committed or drawn a line in the sand to say, when does post-pandemic work location really start? And honestly, we feel like it's premature to be there yet. I understand that the vaccine, there's a lot of hope that people are getting vaccinated. Some of the programs are starting to come back. We do know, though, that going into the summer, parents are facing still difficulties with potential childcare issues. We're not completely back to quote unquote normal. So we are taking our time to make thoughtful decisions and also really plan for things like space and technology. This isn't something we could turn on overnight and welcome everybody back into the offices, especially as there might still be some social distancing restrictions, as well as this desire for there to be some people continuing to work remotely and plug in to that virtual experience while others are on site. So again, no surprise, considerations here for space and technology include a lot of flexibility. We also have to think about not only reserving conference rooms, which is our norm today, but reserving desks, reserving some of the small huddle spaces and collaboration spaces, and setting that up so when people do come on site, if they're not on site every day, they can be really productive and they can tackle what it is that they need to tackle, problem solving together, meeting face-to-face with their manager, brainstorming, or having some of these events to help increase that social capital and build those relationships. We're also starting to talk about neighborhoods instead of specific dedicated areas for teams, having spaces that are set up as flexible. If you want to come into the work and have some peace and quiet because it's not quiet at home, we want to be able to have those quiet spaces for you to work. If you're here on site because you really want to see your teammates and, again, work together on something, we want to be able to create that space where you're not separated by cubicle walls and have no place to get together. We also have seen, and I'm sure many of you have experienced, the technology needs. We used to be a company that really didn't use the video technology very much at all. We were classic for having the Polycom in the middle of the table and people calling in on teleconference while others were sitting around a table in the room. I don't think we'll go all the way back to that. That seems really almost archaic now and really exclusive. It's nice to see people's faces, even if they're joining remotely. But to enable that, we need to have a pretty significant investment in the technology in our conference rooms, mobile technology that might be able to be wheeled around where you might have collaboration happening and brainstorming. And of course, we need to be thoughtful about planning for that before we have everybody back. Next slide. I'll end with just other considerations that are really important. We are a great place to work and we're very proud of that. And managing our culture and monitoring engagement is really important to us as well. Yes, we want to offer more flexibility because we know all those benefits that Summer talked about in what that means for employees and being able to better balance work and life, potentially reduce stress, have less time commuting and wasting away from their families when they can be able to jump right into work and have a very productive day. We also know that there are challenges with how those decisions are made, who decides, and also how will we continue to keep that sense of camaraderie and connection. How can we replace that innovative brainstorming that might happen in the cafeteria when you're having lunch or when you happen to bump into somebody after a meeting and you can continue the thoughts that were recently discussed? Those are all things that we think require some more planning and, again, really retraining of our leaders and all of our employees to be prepared for what that hybrid work and that more flexible work will look like. No matter what, we're excited about the future. We're excited on the possibilities that this helps us all achieve with hopefully more significant outcomes for the business while maintaining a great place to work. Back to you, Mike.
Thank you, Sarah. That was a great presentation and another one to build on. So I'm sure we're going to have great questions tonight. Our next guest is Professor Jirs Meuris. He's an assistant professor of management and human resources in the Wisconsin School of Business and a faculty affiliate at the Institute for Research on Poverty and the Center for Financial Security. His work focuses on the intersection of behavioral science, human resource management, and public policy, examining how work and organizations shape economic and demographic inequality in society. His published research is not only noted by his peers, but has been featured in media outlets such as NPR, The Wall Street Journal, The Washington Post, and Bloomberg. He received his PhD in organizational behavior and human resource management from the University of Pittsburgh, and we are pleased to have you batting last in our lineup tonight. And Jirs, take it away.
Thanks, Mike. And I'll try to live up to Sarah and Summers' presentations. And so if we can pull up the slides. So I'd like to start by echoing a little bit of what Sarah and Summer talked about, in that to understand what the consequences are of remote work and what it would look like in the future, we have to look at both sides of the employment relationship. And so first we can look at employees and what the data shows, and this is something that both Sarah and Summer talked about, is that preferences have changed for remote work. So this is a survey here, or data from a survey from PricewaterhouseCoopers that showed that while 40% of people were not working remotely, before the pandemic, only about 8% actually want to go back to being fully in the office, right? And so we've seen a shift in preferences for remote work because of the experiences in the pandemic. Next slide, please. From the employer's perspective, so kind of the other side of the equation, what we've seen is employers becoming more comfortable with remote work. But if we take a historical perspective, the employers' preferences for remote work has really been a pendulum. So at probably early 2010, more and more companies start to embrace remote work, at least in part. But what we saw in about 2014, 15, 16, we saw some companies move back towards the other direction. And here's just two examples of that. Bank of America went back from, or took some of their employees who were remote workers, took them back into the office. IBM, same thing happened. Yahoo is probably one of the most famous examples of that happening, and them taking their whole workforce almost remote and then taking them 2 years later back to being in the office. And this is really driven by some key concerns around corporate culture. So is it possible to maintain a strong corporate culture in all remote work environments? Do organizations miss out on the benefits of those water cooler interactions? And there's a lot of research supporting the value of these interactions, of these unexpected, just 5-minute, 1-minute interactions that are really important for innovation and problem solving. And so when we're going all remote, or at least 3-4 days remote out of the week, do we miss out on those interactions? And then the third really key concern that employers have is, do people develop a more transactional relationship with the employer, with their workplace, with their colleagues, right? Because of that psychological distance that you're creating between themselves and the workplace using remote work, are they now less attached to the workplace? Do they become less embedded in the workplace? And because of that, they might be more likely to leave. They might look at just the way they interact with the employer as more transactional, more tit for tat, rather than growing more attached and identifying with the employer. Next slide, please. So when we actually look at the data from employers, a lot of times what we see is that executives range in whether or not they believe that remote work will be a good idea. So this is from the same PricewaterhouseCoopers survey that asked, if COVID-19 was not a concern, how often does a typical employee need to be in the office? So what we see here is that only about 5% say that employees don't need to be in the office to maintain a company culture. About 50% or over 50% say 3 days or more, right? And so there is still, across a lot of employers, this idea that if we want to have this attachment, if we want to have this strong corporate culture, we need to be in the office at least for the majority of the time. And so what you see is the employees desiring more remote work, and the employers becoming more comfortable with it, but also having some really key concerns to how viable is that, especially in the long term. Next slide, please. So when we think about what are the effects of remote work, how viable is it? Usually the answer is it depends, right? So a lot of times people ask me, for example, how will remote work affect our organization? How will it affect our performance? And usually the answer is one that doesn't necessarily satisfy their need, because it depends on a lot of different factors. And I want to emphasize 3 considerations here that would affect how viable remote work is. And the first consideration is, how will employees manage their work-life boundaries? And so you've probably seen a lot of news articles around work-life balance, working from home. Here's how to separate your work from your home, because it's very, very difficult. Now you no longer have that natural boundary of commuting, of going into the office. And so people are constantly trying to navigate creating those boundaries, setting up those boundaries. And so the research really suggests 3 effective ways of doing that. One is trying to emulate office routines, right? So having a routine of going to work. What does that look like in the morning when you go to work? And thinking about, do I still go through the same steps as if I would go into the office, or do I just get straight out of bed and go to work? And it's having that routine in the morning tends to be effective at setting up a boundary. The second way is creating physical workspaces. For example, having a workroom, having a dedicated work space that you're only in for work, and also having dedicated tools, for example, work computer, right? So you can put that computer aside when you're not working, be on another computer that's for something different. And so again, trying to create that boundaries. And the third way is setting clear expectations and addressing violations, which may seem very, very obvious, but it's actually the most common reason that people tend to have poor work-life balance in a remote work setting, because it's very easy for your manager to maybe ask you, oh, can you do this for 15 minutes, even though you said you were going to be done at 5 p.m.? Can you do this for 15 more minutes? Can you do this for 20 minutes, right? So they might ask once, then they might ask a second time. And before you know it, you're creating norms. And because you're creating those norms, now it becomes something that is expected of you, right? And so the work can creep in past the boundaries that you've initially set. And so it's having those clear boundaries, having those clear routines so people know what to expect of you. They know not to ask you to do certain things at this time. They know when to ask you to do certain things or when you're going to be able to do certain things. It's very important to setting those boundaries, especially early on, right? It's once you've changed your norms, it's very hard to go back. Next slide, please. The second consideration is really about how will managers manage remote workers. So this is some data from a survey that was done around what managers think remote workers' performance will be. Will it be lower or higher than workers who are in the office? And what you see here is a distribution. A lot of people are unsure. Some people might agree, disagree. But what you see is that there's no real consensus of whether productivity of remote workers will be equal or possibly even better than those who are working in the office. And so when we look at the same survey, what we see is that 26% of managers lack confidence in their employees' work skills. 20% of managers did not feel they could coordinate a team of remote workers effectively. And so what the data suggests is that 1 in 5 managers doesn't feel comfortable managing remote workers. And so a key consideration for the viability of remote work is, does the organization sufficiently train managers to manage remote workers? And that can be something as simple as understanding the difference between checking up on your employees versus checking in on your employees, right? What does that look like? How do you frame interactions? What's the frequency? And those kinds of things. And we know that when managers do the right behaviors, it can have very powerful effects and very positive effects on remote workers and increase the likelihood of getting positive outcomes. When we don't do that, managers tend to rely on technology as a crutch, more as a monitoring device, trying to make sure that employees are working when they're supposed to be working. And we know from the monitoring literature that that tends to have more negative effects. Next slide, please. And then the final consideration is, when we're talking about remote work, are we talking about work from home or work from anywhere? So this is an article that was in the Los Angeles Times just a couple of days ago, talking about Lake Tahoe, and that they were having this influx of remote workers from who used to work in Silicon Valley, who are now living in Lake Tahoe. And so when we think about remote work, are we talking about just people working at home, maybe some days in the week, and then going into the office? Maybe they don't go into the office at all, but they're just working at home in the same geographical location. Or can they go live anywhere they want? And the benefits is that we can allow employees to meet their geographical preferences, right? And so we can get employees closer to their preferences. But there are challenges associated with it, right? So for example, time zones. Once you're on the East Coast or you're on the West Coast, there's different time zones, right? And now we have to account for those differences in time zones. There's questions about availability, right? an employee can't just hop into their car and be in the office when they need to be. Now it involves a plane potentially and getting there, and there's more planning involved. The other questions around compensation, which is an area of that I do research in, and when we think about cost of living adjustments, right? Should we adjust your compensation based upon where you decide to live? So if we're based in Silicon Valley, should we be paying you the same as people who live in San Francisco, even though you're going to live somewhere in the middle of nowhere in Kansas, right? And so, or should we adjust pay? And so when we think about the viability of remote work, it's also, do we allow employees to go live anywhere they want, or do we allow them to be remote workers, but we still want them within the same geographical location? And whichever way we decide to go on that question will also determine some of the viability of remote work. So, but these considerations altogether will eventually determine what consequences of remote work are more likely to occur.
Thank you, Jirs. Great presentation. So we've had now all three of our speakers. We're ready to take audience questions, but I'd like to start out with something, and maybe I'll direct it first to Sarah, since you have an undergraduate degree in psychology. And then Jirs, you've got some behavioral science. So what I'm wondering is, when workers tell us what they want now about a future in which we don't have a pandemic, can they really assess how they're going to be feeling 6 months from now or not? What are your thoughts on that, Sarah?
Gosh, I really think that comes down to the individual. And I know, just like all of us, we've formed certain routines now. We have a new routine. Perhaps it's working from home, perhaps it's doing some of the hybrid work, but it's hard to imagine changing that. And I'm really passionate about this topic. Just a quick story. About the week before we sent everybody home because of the pandemic, we were packing up our offices in one part of the UW Research Park to move into a brand new headquarters building, which is beautiful and full of our dining service and fitness centers and all these amenities. We were very excited to have employees utilize and be part of their space. Most of this, I'm in that building right now. I've been here most of the pandemic because it's empty. And most of those employees have never stepped foot in this building. So as people think about what could work back at the office look like, I'm worried they're thinking about the old office and not even giving the chance for potentially the new office space. And for us to, I think, really experience what that could be like, I think we as employers have to be open to some trial here and some piloting. Even as people started coming back to the office during the pandemic, when people felt it might be safer or realized they weren't really productive working from home, there was a sense of almost re-onboarding to what that is like. And I think we have to be flexible and think of different creative ways we can give people a preview to what that post-pandemic on-site work life could be.
Jirs, do you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, there's something called the status quo bias. It's basically where people tend to gravitate toward the status quo or try to avoid changing if they don't know what to expect, right, when they change. And so I think that is somewhat what we'll see here in the future, is where employees have established routines, they now have habits. And there's always the question of what happens when I go away from those habits? What will that look like? And I think to Sarah's point, if as an employer, you can give employees a sense of what that new normal will be, right? What will that look like? I think it's much easier for people to change. Otherwise, they tend to move away from change and resist change because they don't want to go into the unexpected, right? And so it's about shaping those expectations, and the extent to which employers can effectively do that, I think, will make that transition a little bit easier for their employees.
Great. I want to move to another question, which is, we've kind of established that we can work in person. We've been doing that forever. I think now we feel like we've established we can work where almost everyone is remote. In summer, I think, your slides might have said we're 13% 13% more effective or employee performance is 13% better. I want to know how we measure that at some point, but we'll take that up later. But hybrid is different. You know, it's not all in person. It's not all remote. Are there going to be special problems and bigger investments we need to sink in a hybrid model that are going to change this a little bit? And I'll start with you, Summer.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, candidly, I don't know that any of us really know for sure what that future is going to look like. I almost wonder if hybrid is going to be a greater challenge than it was transitioning to remote, and that you're going to have employees that are on the go, and you don't necessarily have predictability over where they're working and when. So it requires employers who want to support that hybrid work environment to invest in technology to help with scheduling. So there's technology platforms such as one called Tactic, T-A-C-T-I-C, that helps to just track where are employees working and what's the office utilization today. Is there a desk available for me? Additionally, it requires investment in, you know, cameras to support that virtual telepresence feeling. It requires investment, as Jirs was talking about, you know, in training managers, and how do you navigate a meeting if you've got folks remote in different locations, but then you've also got some in the office. So how do you successfully orchestrate such an environment inclusive of those different perspectives? So frankly, as it relates to you know, the challenge, I think it's going to get even greater for employers, and there's going to be a lot of learning as we go, and maybe some will evolve their strategy and their views on hybrid remote work as those learnings play on.
Yeah, we're certainly saying when we come back, that's 1.0, and we'll learn from that, but it's going to be a scheduling challenge to make sure you get the right teams in the office at the right time. You know, one of the things people worry about are the spontaneous collisions often between people on different teams, and, you know, these so-called water cooler interactions. Now, you know, Jirs knows the water cooler interactions at the business school, they're all second guessing the dean. You know, at Exact Sciences, no, they're not second guessing, but, or they're not second guessing Londa Dewey for sure.
No.
I do wonder, how do you feel about that? I mean, obviously there are spontaneous interactions at work that might lead to interesting ideas generated. How do you preserve that, but maybe avoid some of the water cooler interactions that, frankly, you know, how much time could we have spent at my workplace talking about how the Packers have mishandled Aaron Rodgers? I mean, let's be serious. That does happen too. So how do you feel about that? How do you create the positive aspect of the water cooler interactions and maybe not so many of the, you know, just chit chat? And well, undermining the dean.
I'd argue that talking about the Packers or arguing about it is actually a way to help build some of that social capital and build relationships and find connections. And I do think the hybrid environment, you have to plan for that. So that means perhaps not expecting people to call each other. What's really hard is knowing when you can take 5 minutes of someone's time just to check in on them, and feeling like you have to schedule that because you have no visibility. You can't see if their office is open. You can't see if they're off of the phone or off of a call. And it feels like you're interrupting. I think we all have to get a little bit more comfortable using technology as our friend to check in. You know, maybe it's the, hey, let me know when you have 5 minutes and I really want to connect, not urgent kind of messages. I also think that the opportunity for that being planned in meetings, some of that not work talk, some of that, hey, how was your weekend, is something we have to be more thoughtful about, because you're not naturally getting that at the start of every call. And the days can be really exhausting when you're going from a business meeting to a business meeting to a business meeting. We don't have that time to decompress and simply connect.
Good answer. You really came at me there. Summer, anything to add?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with Sarah. There's just a lot of great research that shows the benefit that comes from the those social connections, so those intentional strategies, and equipping managers with tools. So for example, helping them with icebreaker questions. Maybe it doesn't come naturally for them to engage in those check-ins. Being more purposeful for how one-on-one time is used between managers and employees to make sure that there's time for that small talk built in. Another interesting thing is we're seeing some employers that are looking at how can we be more purposeful with our time, and maybe dedicating a certain percentage of time each week focused around innovation and collaboration, so that they can try to inspire more of that innovative thinking that may not naturally come if you're working remotely with hybrid work environments.
Jirs, anything you want to add to this?
I think both Sarah and Summer basically summarized what the research says on this topic. It's that those interactions are important, including talking about the Packers. So that venting about the Packers has been shown to be very important.
Thank God, because I do that.
But it's very difficult to foster that within a remote environment. And so especially when we move towards these hybrid solutions, maybe we think about utilizing the in-person time to really foster those connections, and thinking about remote work for other purposes, right? And so maybe we start to divide up what is most effective to do remotely, what's most effective to do in person, and let's try to organize and structure work to really optimize what we're using our time for in both situations.
We've never had at our organization a conference for our people by our people, but I think we're going to do that as a way to create some of that interdisciplinary interaction, just like what is going on across our business, and what are everyone else's thoughts about that. I mean, we need to do something like that. So Eric Johnson has chimed in and wonders, will there be vaccine passports when it comes to who can come to work? And might that depend on whether it's emergency use authorization vaccines or finally approved by the FDA vaccines? Sarah, you want to chime in on that? What do you do?
Yeah, happy to share. For Exact Sciences, we are not requiring the vaccine. We are strongly encouraging it and really trying to find ways to connect our employees with the vaccination source. We've been lucky with that workforce that's been working on site. Over 70% have volunteered that they've been vaccinated. And that shows us that I don't think we have to do a lot of convincing or kind of campaigning to have that take place. And because it is something that is a concern for people who are thinking, I'll only go back to the workplace if it's safe, we want to continue making sure that's strongly encouraged.
Summer, any thoughts on that?
I think Sarah said it really well. Most of the employers that we're talking with, they're taking a similar approach with that strongly encourage, but certainly respecting where there are employees who perhaps have different views and want to take an alternative approach, and seeing to what extent accommodations can be made. It's just a couple employers that I'm aware of that we're working with at QTI, where they've actually said in order to come into the office, you do have to have had a vaccination.
So I've questioned a little of the conventional wisdom about the value of water cooler chat. You guys shot me down. I'm going to question another thing, which is the executive's view on culture. We got to be in person to have our culture. And maybe you have to be in person to have the kind of culture you had before, but could you have a better culture by having a hybrid model or even a remote model in some cases? Is that possible? And what would that take? And Jirs, I'll hand it off to you first to rely on some of your behavioral science insights.
So I think it's the idea that you have to be in person to have a strong corporate culture is, of course, more of the traditional viewpoint of corporate culture, and everyone has to be there, and we all have to be together, right? Physically together there.
It's all we knew.
Yeah, that's how it's always been, right? And so the question about can you build a strong culture of remote workers? Potentially you could, but then it's the question of how do you make people feel attached to your organization without being physically present? And so you're always fighting this psychological distance between the person and the organization, right? So if we think about two circles, one circle is who you are and your identity, and we have the other circle be the organization, is how could we get that closer together? And as I was browsing the comments that were coming in from viewers, I saw some people talking about branded corporate jackets and those kind of things, right? And the extent to which you can make people feel part of that culture, I think is very important to being successful and not having your culture suffer from going towards probably a hybrid type of model.
Summer, any thoughts on that?
Well, thank you, Mike. You're a mind reader, because I was hoping I could weigh in on this question. I had a privilege of viewing this done firsthand when I worked at D9, which was acquired by Accenture. So it was a technology startup organization. We were implementing an HRIS called Workday. And when I was hired, I was employee number 94, and most of our workforce was spread out across not only the country, but the world, and operating remotely. And in the time I was there, we doubled in size, or more than doubled in size, but had a really strong culture. And some of the ways that that was done, first of all, we had phenomenal leadership that really invested in employees. And so every Friday we had an all company call that was a do not miss. Everyone, logged in, and we'd have new hires that would be featured. They would share important company updates. So that was one tactic. We also had really strong transparency into performance metrics to just track who's performing and who's not, and we managed those out that weren't. But it really fostered that high performance culture. And the third thing I'd say is, we really committed to intentional social get-togethers. So employees were on the go, but whenever there was, folks in a common location, we would try to do happy hours, dinners, things like that to just really build that camaraderie beyond what we'd get through other social channels.
Great, thank you. Karen Lunda wonders, how are employers, addressing needs for home office setups? Part of the productivity advantage of work from home might be, people aren't needing as much office space, but if we go to a hybrid model, maybe I still have to have office space, and now I've got to spend a lot of money on technology for hybrid meetings and technology for people to have in their home. How are employers addressing that? And Sarah, I'll kick that to you.
Sure. Well, it's certainly an investment, and it's interesting to think about where we were a year ago today. As employees were just kind of getting used to this work from home. It was a huge shift. It happened suddenly, and kind of figuring out and getting into the groove of what that looked like. It's funny to think about. We were afraid. People started asking if they could come pick up their chair. The chair that they had at their desk, because sitting on this bar stool at my kitchen island is not going to work much longer, and we absolutely wanted to avoid the ergonomic issues and other things that come from having a poor home office setup. And it's funny to think we were kind of like, gosh, should we let people come and pick up their chairs? What if they never come back? And a year later, obviously, we did go for allowing people to get their chairs and built a system so that some of that IT technology. The other thing that people really wanted was the dual monitors, and most people don't have a dual monitor setup if you're not used to working from home. Well, those things really aid in productivity. So I think employers have to look at the cost benefit of, yes, it's an investment, and it could help with engagement. It could help you save on ergonomic issues and work related injuries, as well as that productivity piece. So we've supported that, and we've tried to have some standardized aspects of what that home office setup is, as well as giving a stipend for those things. If you really need your huge stacks of Post-it notes, go for it. That's what you can use the stipend for.
So Donald Wen wonders whether you could all comment on how remote work might minimize the carbon footprint, and is that something employers actually care about? Sarah, why don't you start? And then we'll go around the horn.
We have a large employee group in the San Francisco Bay Area, And one of my favorite icebreaker questions as I visited that site and that team was to ask how long people's commutes were. And I feel spoiled. I think spending 20 minutes on the Beltline is a terrible commute here in Madison, but understanding that people were spending 90 minutes to 2 hours each way of their day, either taking public transportation or driving their cars and sitting in traffic, obviously that time given back is probably life years saved also from not having road rage and stressful commutes, but also that carbon footprint is a big deal. And that will be something we want to try to track and measure as well from a sustainability perspective.
Sarah? I'm sorry, Summer.
Yeah, I think it's well said, and I think that it's really based on organization values, and that their views on corporate social responsibility and where they are on that journey. I'm certainly seeing some that are bought into that savings, that alignment beyond just carbon footprint from commuting. Think about how much fewer printing expenses. For one, I used to print a lot when I was back at the office. Now that I'm at home, I never print. So it's really just been, for me, transformational in the way I work. And I'm sure many other employers have seen similar savings for their employees beyond just commuting and printing.
Absolutely. Yours, what are you finding at the university?
Well, this hits close to home because I had about last March, I had about 4 days to transition from in-person teaching to remotely teaching all my classes. And so I think, in terms of the carbon footprint, I think Summer is right. It depends on kind of what the company values, what employees value, and whether that is going to drive a lot of the decision-making around remote work. On the other side of it is employers are also looking at the costs of kind of real estate, of electricity, of those kind of things, and finding that if they could cut down on those costs, that can be beneficial for them. And then employees are looking at the cost of the commute, both in time, in energy, in obviously in gas and those kinds of things as well, and seeing the benefits of that. And so I think it's partly carbon footprint, but also partly that there are some cost savings associated with not having to do the commute and not having to have employees in a physical space that are also motivating some of this adoption.
Yeah, we estimated that for our median commute in our employee base, it's $45 a day if you value their time at roughly their wage rate, and the 56 cents a mile or whatever the reimbursement rate is. And, that's real. And, you have to take that into account as a real consideration. So a question I want to ask, in Summer's data, one of the stats that really jumped out at me is, I think 29% of the folks that are working at home, I think it's people it's conditional on you're already working at home, would quit if they couldn't work remotely all the time. And, I do wonder if there isn't a bit of a mismatch in the aggregate between what employees want and what employers will ultimately do that will maybe create a lot of turnover in the workforce as the pandemic ends. I mean, I think two things could drive that turnover. One is, nobody's really selling their house and moving, or at least not many people right now. They're riding out the pandemic. But then secondly, there's now this big issue that employers and employees need to work out. And if it doesn't go the right way, there might be a lot of people that look for other options. Could we see a big spike in labor market turnover as we kind of get to the other side of the pandemic? And I'll start with you, Summer, because you've been talking to a lot of different employers.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there's been a lot of research done by different sources, such as the statistic you quoted, that was from Live Career, a study of over 1,000 employees, SHRM studies of over thousands of employees, Microsoft too, and consistently finding that yes, employees are interested in having that remote work flexible option. Employers still holding back a little bit on what their decision's going to be, not sure what the others are going to do, what that future is going to hold. But some other interesting data in this regard that supports what we're predicting of this potential talent tsunami is a study that from Microsoft of over 30,000 employees that found that 41% of workers that they're considering leaving their current employer this year, and 46% of those say that it's because they now have opportunities to work remotely. So, at the end of the day, employers' approach to hybrid work is going to influence a lot of this. So I think there's this tension between employees and employers of what's going to happen. And then, from an employer perspective, anxiety over, what if employees call our bluff? What's going to happen? So definitely something that's going to be interesting to see play out.
The water cooler could be a lonely place.
Yes.
Jirs, what are you thinking about that issue? Could there be a surge in turnover?
I think there will be for a couple of reasons. The first would be that people haven't moved, right? And so there's probably some people who were thinking about moving anyway, who are just waiting to move. The second would be opportunity. If you can really work from anywhere, you could change jobs and you're not really confined anymore. And the third is that people probably use this time as a period of reflection. Do I still want to do this? Do I want to change my career? Do I want to work for another organization, right? And so this time probably is a period of reflection as well. I think for employers who are worried about that, so I've done research on work hours and particularly overtime, moonlighting, and so how do employers manage that? And so one of the things that I find is that the closer you can push policies towards employees' preference, the more likely you're to get positive outcomes in that people don't leave, and also that organizations tend to perform better. The more you pull away from those preferences, the more that you're going to get people leaving and lower levels of performance. And so to employers who are worried about that, it's really now the challenge of how can you get closer to those preferences, keeping in mind some of the considerations and some of the potential pitfalls, and how can you create a work environment that people want to stay in that match their preferences better. And so that's going to be the real challenge if employers want to avoid people leaving for work environments that do better match their preferences.
Sarah, how's exact sciences going to be a winner in this process?
Well, I think it's something that Summer mentioned earlier. We are really focusing on ensuring that people feel connected to our company's mission. If the only thing that is going to make you stay or leave is the location, I don't know if we can change that, given there's personal reasons that people are looking at other opportunities or different locations. But really that making sure that people are engaged in the work, they feel good about what they do. And then as Jirs just said, we take into account those preferences and try to meet people where they are, or at least closer to where they want to be, so that they have that flexibility they need. I can also add that from a talent acquisition perspective, especially in the recent months, the location question, we post location on our job postings on where the work is to be performed or where it's located. And as you saw pre-pandemic, most of our jobs were located at one of our work locations and office sites. Now the question is coming up constantly. Is there any flexibility with this job? Do I have to work from Madison or from San Francisco or from wherever, or can I work from other locations? And so we have to train our recruiting staff and our teams to really talk about what that means. And also that's kind of the pressure for us to make a decision and come up with what our post-pandemic world will look like.
Summer, how do we get the full benefit of a diverse workforce if we're working remotely?
Oh, that's a really great question, because certainly we know that it first starts with an inclusive environment, right, and fostering that within the organization. A lot of investment in managers and your talent acquisition folks, as Sarah was just describing, making sure that not only are you setting up that right environment, but you're also broadening the pools in which you're engaging within to look beyond. That's one benefit, as we were talking about the commuting with remote work, is there or some where certain work locations were just inaccessible to marginalized groups due to the high cost of living, transportation, all of that. So now my hope is that in this next normal, we're going to have greater access and greater equitable opportunities as it comes to the future of work.
Great, thank you. I know we're past the top of the hour. I promised we would end at 8. I haven't quite met that, but I just want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. I mean, what a great discussion, great perspectives from all of you, and the data that you brought and the analysis and how you think about these issues is very helpful to everybody, and helpful to me in particular. We're in the middle of this as well. So thank you all for joining us tonight, and appreciate you taking time for your alma mater and your university years. So
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
all right, so great discussion tonight. I can't wait to come back next week when we're going to turn the focus back to public higher education in Wisconsin as we approach the biennial budget. I hope you'll join us. As always, great to be with you tonight. Thanks for tuning in on Wisconsin.
You can try, but you'll never stop a Badger. Because we Badgers are born with curious minds and endless heart. When we see a curve in the road, we speed up. When there are mask shortages for first responders, we make our own supply chain. When there's a world on pause, we sharpen our claws. Through thunder, fire, and pandemics, we'll keep going. Because after all, you can't stop a Badger.